Okay, so the first successful thing to do for a TED Talk is not fall on the stairs. So I've already done it. I can go back happy now. Spoken word poetry. How many of you have seen a spoken word performance? Pretty cool. Okay, that's gonna, yeah, I can work with that. So spoken word poetry is performance poetry. It's a very dynamic and changing art form. What I tell you about it today may not be true about it in the future, in the years to come, and that definitely isn't something that might have been true in the past. It takes elements of theater, of music, hip hop, jazz. It started with the beat poets, and spoken word poetry has now become one of the most prominent forms of poetry today. It's not your grandfather's poetry. It's not Walt Whitman's poetry. It's not fucking Robert Frost. It's something else entirely. And I hope you recognize that this dynamic art form is going to be playing a huge role, especially with new media forms like YouTube and audio recording and sound poetry. So who becomes a spoken word artist? Well, there's a lot of us who used to write poetry when we were like 12 to 17, and most of us probably don't want to share that type of poetry. But a lot of spoken word artists write from places of despair or loneliness or trauma or hurt, which a lot of teenagers think they're feeling. And they go on to become spoken word artists because they learn to take that experience and transform themselves in a way that they can relate to other people. The transformation that occurs with spoken word poets, I think, is the most important part of becoming a spoken word poet, more than actually getting up on stage and reciting, because you take a look at yourself in a way that you haven't done before, and you allow yourself to heal in such a way that other people can witness your process of change as well. The vulnerability that spoken word poets employ is something that I want to see all the time. Okay, I was just checking there was a title there. It's something that I want to see all the time. So the next thing I want to talk about is politics. My whole talk, even though it's already started, is going to be about poetry and politics and the intersection of the two. I think it's incredibly interesting because art has always been political. There has never been something such as apolitical art. And if you do know an artist or someone who says they do apolitical art, they probably don't undergo the same types of oppression or discrimination or marginalization that a lot of poets go through. Poets in the past have always been the outsiders, the rejects, the bards, the minstrels, the traveling people. The spoken tradition, the oral tradition of storytelling dates back thousands of years through every single culture that we have, all the way to Homer, to what some people say Shakespeare is a spoken word poet. These traditions matter because it shows us that there have always been people willing to tell stories that other people don't want to hear or don't want to listen to. Ginsberg was put on trial, right, for the poetry that he wanted to express and the poetry that he wrote. Poets have always been persecuted. As a side note, it also doesn't pay very well. So the fact that poets get up are brave individuals and do so out of passion and art and a lot of times survival means that they're really contributing in a way that is personal and meaningful. You should all pay for the arts, by the way. So I think it's interesting that the personal and the vulnerable side of side of poetry can turn into political influence. And right now you see so many politicians that like to support the arts, that like to say they are part of the arts. But the whole institution of politics is based on oppressive regimes created by white men in power, right? They cater to homeowners' interests. They cater to people who are already entrenched in the system. Now, more than even before, you see that the same people gaining political influence in the political realm are those who have already had it. A third Bush ran for president. Three Bushes, another Clinton, okay? Like, how many people have to run before we realize that the systems that were set up to give equal voice to everyone aren't working? The spoken word stage wants to take the lowest common denominator, the minority voice, and lift that voice up and give them an audience that they would never otherwise have. Politics, on the other hand, tells you that everyone has an equal voice because you get one equal vote. The unit of political engagement is your vote, not your individual, not the individual self that you are. So now your story doesn't matter, your background doesn't matter, who you are doesn't matter as long as your vote is the exchange that's being made. When poetry is an exchange, the poet makes an exchange with the audience by burdening you with the words that they say or by empowering you with the words. I hope that at the end of the day, you take something away from all these TED Talks and that it's something that does resonate for what you've said. As a side note, if you hear something that a poet's saying that you like, we snap our fingers like this. Okay, some people like what I'm saying. That's great. That's all good. It's all good. It started out in the States with a lot of African-American poets and a lot of African-American individuals, because they would gather in these halls and the white police would say that they were clapping too loud. So they started snapping. That was a revolution. That was a movement. That's what spoken word poetry does. Unlike politics, which doesn't build communities around it, and politicians who say they represent community interests, spoken word poets have naturally built communities around them. They look at each other and they find resilience in the stories that we tell. A lot of times art is not just art for the sake of art, it is art for survival, it is art for healing. I think it's interesting. At some point, an artist did something cool, or they wrote something, or they made something, and someone else said, hey, I'll give you $100 for that. When your art is made from yourself, with who you are, that artist probably felt horrible selling themselves for the first time. I don't think it's necessarily appropriate to always try to buy someone's art without understanding the story and the place that they come from, because art has always existed in the context that it was made in. Nina Simone said that every artist has an obligation to reflect the times that they're in. They should always reflect the current political atmosphere. They should reflect the conversations that we're having. Artists do have an obligation. It is a huge obligation. I have seen what art has done to my friends. I have seen the burden that art places on us, on our emotional stability, on our professional life. These are not simple burdens. The artists undergo so many transformations for the masses that we don't always appreciate. Politics is all about shutting a lot of those voices out. We don't want to have the artists taking up a main center stage or running for office, because I think we're afraid of the change that they might incite. The fact that you hear an artist and you feel moved by them means that you are connecting with them on a level that you don't with the politicians in society today. If you treasure the feeling of listening to an artist or seeing an artist perform so much, why wouldn't you demand the same type of relationship with the people who are supposed to represent your interests? A politician will appeal to the lowest common denominator and say they may have 500 votes, but they can't tell you that they know 500 stories, 500 tales of trials and jubilations that someone went through. My parents immigrated here in the 80s. They saw the first Trudeau, another institution of power, by the way, they saw the first Trudeau gain power. That story matters when the second Trudeau is elected and is reflected in the art that I perform and the art that I engage in today. Poets are the people's politicians. And, to quote my friend Kaz Mega, politicians are evil clones. I'm not saying that every politician isn't someone worth believing in. You've had people who came on stage today who are excellent politicians, but they're only excellent because they actually connect to other human beings. The human connection is what makes it possible for them to do successfully in their jobs. And that's why poets and artists and spoken word artists have always been at the floor lines listening to the faults and the conversations happening on the ground. The communities that we build around us can be mobilized and used in the political realm to actually affect the changes that we want. And it starts very simply. You have a conversation with an artist. You go to a show. You treat it as more than entertainment, because the spoken word community especially has taken upon themselves to bring so many different social issues to light. As an individual that exists at the borderlines of very many different types of oppression, my very existence is political. The personal story that I tell is political. The way that I engage with you right now is political. And the political forces around me shape who I am, which in turn shape the stories that I'm telling and bringing forth to the stage today. The personal is political, and you should treat individuals in the artistic community as political units, as people whose political interests matter, instead of shutting them off to the sides or bringing them up on stage when you want to look like you support the arts. I think that's incredibly important. I think a lot of corporate people do that, a lot of politicians do that, and that formula has to fundamentally change. The flaw in big politics today is that in the future, if money and influence are going to be the things that keep determining whose voice is heard first or the loudest, individual communities of people are going to be left out. I think if big politics goes back to its roots in the community, as treating the individuals as individuals with complex stories and reasons for their being, we go back to a system of political engagement that treats everyone as equal through process of equity, not just equal through the process of giving everyone an equal vote. So, it's probably pretty facetious of me to come up here and talk all about poetry and politics and not perform a poem for you. So I'm going to perform the first poem that I ever wrote. I wrote this while I was living in a small community of about 500 people, 9 hours north of here. I was living on Beaver First Nation Reserve. Great people. Very, very lonely for a full-time city girl. I kind of went a little insane. So I ended up producing huge amounts of art, much of which is now framed in my bedroom, and writing a lot. So I came back into town with this poem in my pocket. I went to the open mic, and I performed this piece. Afterwards, a family came up to me, and a mother hugged me without permission, and her son said, "You made a whole table of Eastern Europeans cry." Now that is a special type of guilt. They called me a coconut because I breathed in boy bands, not Bollywood. Wrote fan fiction instead of formulas, learned to shave before I learned to love. They called me a coconut, but no, my parents aren't racist. No, I'm not like them, nothing like them, I love you. I choose you, but I still can't take you home tonight. When they call you a coconut, they teach you the following. 1, if he likes you, it is because you are not like other Indian girls. 2, if he likes you, it is because he thinks that he can handle your spice. 3, if he likes you, it is because you are the best exotic that he can find. 4, because the only way that you can be loved is if you choose sides. My first therapist thinks that I am just caught in the middle. She is so proud of her stunning revelation that I sit back and smile. Yes, it is depressing. I am a child running my toes through dirty sand, hoping it falls away darker after I've touched it. Yes, it is depressing that I wanted to be white. They called me a coconut, but I fucking hate Russell Peters. That was supposed to be my job. Where else will I find the strength to laugh at the threat of a beating? Where will I be applauded for standing witness to a father's rage? Women who tremble in silent servitude as their hands roll out dinner, their locked lips teach their children that if he hits you, it is because you deserved it. And if she hits you, it's because you didn't know any better. I learned that a mother's love feels a lot like the moment where a tired palm finds redemption on a child's cheek. Dear white people, I'm sorry that I was jealous of your parents' divorce. I'm sorry that I offered a sick, bitter envy instead of sympathy. I'm sorry that your broken home sounded the same as my hopeful heart because Russell's dad was breaking hangers on his back. Russell's mom was watching, sacrificing her son because she could hardly save herself. She used to hold him at nighttime when she'd whisper that she was sorry, that I deserved it. I was my father's favorite. That means I watched. It was all I'd ever seen my mother do. They called me a coconut. Brown on the outside, white on the inside. Inside, there was only 23 years of hollowing yourself out to be filled by someone else's expectations, so that you, like a real coconut, can be judged in the palms of others and put aside in search of something better. Thank you.